Dr. Sam Goldhaber. I'm president of NATF, and today on Clot Chronicles, I'm going to talk about risk factor modification for prevention of atrial fibrillation. We think of atrial fibrillation as a problem with a cardiac rhythm disturbance and nothing more than that. But as we do research on the topic of atrial fibrillation, we're starting to understand that atrial fibrillation is a systemic illness, and this systemic illness shows itself as atrial fibrillation. Patients with atrial fibrillation often have other problems that cause systemic effects, and these include cigarette smoking, obesity, diabetes, and hypertension. Until now, we've been focusing on giving anticoagulants to prevent stroke from atrial fibrillation. And sometimes we give special anti-arrhythmic medication to try to suppress the atrial fibrillation itself. Sometimes we take patients to the electrophysiology or EP laboratory and ablate the focus of atrial fibrillation in an attempt to cure it or reduce the frequency of atrial fibrillation. But what is now becoming apparent is that in addition to anticoagulation or antiarrhythmic medication or ablation, that modifying common cardiovascular risk factors can play an important role in reducing the frequency of atrial fibrillation attacks and in addition in reducing the frequency of stroke from atrial fibrillation. And they're quite straightforward. If you quit smoking cigarettes, if you get the blood pressure under control, if you work with the internal medicine doctor or endocrinologist to control diabetes more carefully, these really straightforward measures can make a great deal of positive difference in reducing the frequency of atrial fibrillation and reducing important consequences of atrial fibrillation, such as stroke. And also being active every day is very important, reducing overweight, reducing obesity, reducing what we call the metabolic syndrome, which would be a combination of a high blood sugar and being overweight, all benefit the patient with atrial fibrillation in terms of reducing the systemic manifestations of this illness. So now, more and more frequently, when you see a cardiologist or other specialist in atrial fibrillation, there'll be emphasis on stroke prevention of atrial fibrillation by prescribing an anticoagulant, but there will also be renewed and more intensified emphasis on risk factor modification of reversible risk factors, such as cigarette smoking, high blood pressure, and obesity. This is Dr. Sam Goldhaber signing off for Clot Chronicles.